Please welcome back one last time Danielle Allen of the Democratic Knowledge Project, who will lead a discussion on library and learning in pluralistic society with President Ron Daniels of Johns Hopkins University, Professor Akhil Amar of Yale University, Robert Runcie of Chiefs of Change, Selena Stewart of the League of Women Voters, and Victoria Hughes of America 250.
Fantastic. Oh, there we go. Good. We made it. Here we are. We are at the last panel of the day, and I am so excited to have the chance to be with all of you for this important conversation. It's been an incredibly rich 2 days, and so I don't know about all of you, but I'm just buzzing with the great student work that I saw, the great educators that I've heard from. I had one student who was showing me work that they had done developing a play for their school, a play to teach about the Constitution to the lower grades. And she said to me, well, what we really thought about was, for those kindergartners, how were we going to motivate them? Because I want them to know, I want those kindergartners to know that their vote counts. I was like, yes, that's what we are working on, right from the very beginning, making sure everybody understands that they have an ownership stake in our democracy. We have an incredibly distinguished panel here to close us out. We are going to be talking about one of the themes of this conference, pluralism. Pluralism names the fact of we are so different in our identities and divergent in our ideologies, and yet also there is an ethic to that we're going to respect, relate, and cooperate with each other. We are going to bring common ground out of pluralism. So we're going to talk a bit about how to do that. I'm going to start by reminding us about something that James Madison wrote in Federalist 10. And we all have to remember that when the Constitution was drafted, it was a time of great division in this country. The Articles of Confederation had imploded, there was paralysis, there was gridlock, and just people were at each other's throats. So Madison wrote, there are two methods of removing the causes of faction. The one, by destroying the liberty which is essential to its existence. The other, by giving to every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. It could never be more truly said than of the first remedy that it was worse than the disease. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an element without which it instantly expires. But it could not be less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life, because it nourishes faction, than it would be to wish the annihilation of air, which is essential to animal life, because it imparts to fire its destructive agency. The second expedient, that is giving everybody the same opinions, is as impracticable as the first would be unwise. As long as the reason of man continues fallible, and he is at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. As long as the connection subsists between his reason and his self-love, his opinions and his passions will have a reciprocal influence on each other. The former will be objects which the latter will attach themselves to. The diversity in the faculties of men, from which the rights of property originate, is not less an insuperable obstacle to a uniformity of interests. The protection of these faculties is the first object of government. From the protection of different and unequal faculties, the possession of different degrees and kinds of property immediately results, and from the influence of these on the sentiments and views of the respective proprietors ensues a division of the society into different interests and parties. So there you have it. Liberty means faction, means difference of opinion, means interests and parties and passions. And here we are because we love liberty. Pluralism is the challenge of liberty. The question for this panel is how, across our different fields of working in civic learning, are we supporting that approach to pluralism, which is also about that ethic of respecting, relating, and cooperating across lines of difference. We are also pulling together the project of a universal civic learning strategy on this panel that is about working K through 12. Robert Runcie will here represent Chiefs for Change, talking about that. It is about higher education. President Daniels, Professor Amar will represent higher education. It is about civil society, all of the organizations of volunteers working in communities. Selena Stewart from the League of Women Voters will represent that part. And Victoria Hughes from America 250 and the administration will represent the whole, the society as a whole, altogether. So with that overlong introduction, I'd love to turn to Professor Daniels first to talk a little bit about how pluralism is playing a role as you think about what universities owe to democracy, the title of your important book.
Thank you, and it's just great to be here and to be part of this very important conversation. Danielle, as you indicated, I have been talking and working for a time and then ultimately set out some of these arguments in the book you referred to, What Universities Owe Democracy, but was really an effort to demonstrate the extent to which the university was an indispensable part of our modern democracy, that we have very important roles to discharge. And as much as we like to think about and make the case for the support we should receive, that we have clear responsibilities that we owe to the society, but in particular that we owe to the preservation and strengthening of our democracy. And so, as I set out the case for why we are indispensable to the effective functioning of democracy, focused on the role that that universities play in promoting social mobility, modeling equal opportunity for students who come in or educated at our institutions, a role that we should play in civic education, something that I've really been inspired by the work that you have done. The role that we play in essentially curating facts and knowledge, and how, when we're at our best, we are the place that can most effectively mediate claims to truth and fact and accuracy. And then finally, the role that we can play in modeling and nurturing a commitment to pluralism, what I call purposeful pluralism. And it's here that it's on that last point, which really goes to your question, where what I was really struck by was the extent to which, certainly for the last several decades, there had been so much focus on how we think about barriers to entry to our institutions, how we broaden access, how we think about diversity of experience, of ideas, of composition of our student bodies and our faculty, but less attention to how we actually take advantage of the very heterogeneous communities that we've created and ensure that there are conversations, there are interactions that really make sense of the communities that we have created. And I think for a lot of us, composition, diversity, heterogeneity in itself was what was focused upon, and less about the kind of interactions that you need to ready our students in particular for the responsibilities of democratic citizenship when they graduate. And it's there that in a number of ways, some very large scale and highly interventionist, some more subtle, that I thought about how we might cultivate the kinds of interactions that demonstrate the possibilities for pluralism. And I should say that I think what's really striking is, particularly in light of what I know to be the concerns that have been surfaced over the last several days here, but the things we know well about polarization, discord, distrust in institutions, and so forth. We know that a big part of this polarization is reflected in the ways in which we've sorted ourselves geographically, by institution, by profession, by political party, and so forth. And what's exciting about universities, and what I think really gives us this really fleeting opportunity to do something that can change the trajectory of our country, is that we have these communities which are enormously diverse on a number of different dimensions, and how this gives us an opportunity to give students the skills, the values, the knowledge to do something different in the way in which you manage, harness, and thrive in a pluralist setting.
Great, thank you so much, President Daniels. Professor Amar, I mean, you are a constitutional scholar. I just introduced Madison and his vision of faction as necessary in a society of liberty. The Constitution and our universities and schools need to equip us to deal with that experience of faction. What do you think we could do to be doing better on college campuses?
Thank you so much for inviting me to Philadelphia. We meet on the 250th, of course, of some very important anniversary of some very important, I would say, world-changing events. So e pluribus, e pluralism unum. So we are many, but we have to also be one. We have to, for example, all vote for president every 4 years and for Congress every 2 years. Yes, every kindergartner needs to vote, and voting isn't just a right, it's a responsibility, and you can't discharge that if you don't know, here's my pitch, the story of America, a narrative. Now, the narrative has to be true and inclusive. And we've had some narratives from earlier generations, national narratives, that were true to some extent, but not particularly inclusive. We have the counter to that has been a multiplicity of narratives that didn't quite actually create a common story. Look, we Americans, you've just heard it, we don't have race in common, or religion, or national origin, first language, geography, politics. So what do we have in common? We have in common, actually, our Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the story behind it, and that story is not, in my view, respectfully, has not been well told. And I think that's bluntly my purpose in life, is to offer one comprehensive narrative. You know, I invite others. And just as an example, let's take, how many of you have experienced in some form the Federalist Papers? Raise your hand. So you're Americans, there's a national narrative, and we all are taught 10. And you're taught 10 because Charles Beard told you to pay attention to 10. It wasn't actually, no one read it at the time. If you had a good argument for why you should vote for the Constitution, would you have waited till your 10th op-ed to make it? Of course you wouldn't, okay? But Beard said, and no one read it at the time, but Beard says it's important, and so all of you did, and you're unified, but that's, actually, he was a slaveholder, and he never freed his slaves, and they didn't tell you that maybe 40 years ago, and that's important. Tonight, I want you to read Federalist 2 and Federalist 8. Each one will take you 3 minutes. One's by Jay, one's by Hamilton. They're actually anti-slavery. They offer a slightly different account of why actually you should vote for the Constitution and what it's all about. So just to conclude, I'll tell you like another fact. So I'm going to say to you a thing, and you're just going to react with a who and a place. So I say to you, the Declaration of Independence, and the who that you come back with is, who comes to mind? Jefferson. Oh, yes, you're right, okay, because John Adams and Ben Franklin were there alongside Jefferson, and they were anti-slavery, and here's what you don't know. It's true and inclusive. The world's first anti-slavery society was formed in Philadelphia in 1775. You didn't know that, but that's true. Immediately after the Declaration of Independence, in that same building, now called Independence Hall, Ben Franklin's going to preside over a state constitutional convention that begins with the words, "All men are born equally free and independent," and that leads to abolition, not freeing slaves, abolishing slavery, and it's the beginning of the first major abolition movement in the world, and it travels through Franklin in Pennsylvania and Adams in Massachusetts, and you won't know that if you're only focusing on Jefferson and Virginia. And so it's a true story. I think it's a more inclusive story, but we need a national narrative. And here's the final thing, tough love. Kids today do not read. They do not read books. They do not read long books, the sort that I write, you know. They do not read books with sophisticated arguments, and unless they do, we die, because we are about our story and our ideas, and the story is complex, and we need to get these kids to read more, and I say that as the father of 3 college kids.
Thank you, Professor Amar. Okay. So, thank you, Professor Amar, for reminding us of the pluralism in the founding. Even in the Federalist Papers, there are multiple voices. There were multiple voices in the Declaration of Independence right from the get-go. So it has been a continuous theme. Now, Bob Runcie, Chiefs for Change, thinking about school districts, where on earth does this concept of pluralism fit into the work of K-12 schools?
Yeah, well, when you look at K-12 schools, they're probably the most pluralistic. Hello.
Is it,
Am I turned off?
Yeah,
I didn't turn it off.
green?
It's green.
Okay. I think
Can you hear me now?
Mine.
Oh, okay. Are we good? All right. So when we think about our K-12 public schools, they're probably the most pluralistic institution in the community when you think of the collective composition, right? Because the school systems don't get to select their customers. Everyone, they've got to serve everyone that shows up there. So what I would say is that they may be pluralistic in demographics. The question is, are they going to be pluralistic in the culture, the policies, and the actions that are actually within the system? And from my perspective as a former superintendent and running a network of over 50 superintendent and state chiefs, what I would say to you is that it starts at the top. The leader is going to set the tone around how the system deals with all of the different voices, the different ethnicities and backgrounds and perspectives that exist within the system. And that is a pretty significant piece of it. And I'll also tell you that the role of a superintendent and a system leader is something that we've been working on to change and redefine, right? Most people think of these folks as they get into these jobs that, they're the academic person, they're the headmaster. When folks get evaluated and they interview for these jobs, they look at their whole academic record. I can't tell you how many times superintendents have come to me and said, geez, I didn't realize this was the job. It's really not about academics. I'm spending 80% of my time dealing with the politics and all the other pieces of developing relationships, et cetera. So the job actually is 80% being a civic leader. And when you think about it, it kind of makes sense because our kids spend about 80% of their time outside of our classrooms in the community. And so if you're going to impact kids and really move the needle, not incremental movement, but really substantial, dramatic changes, you're going to have to do that in a way where you're building a network of support, of wraparound services, of engaged learning and enrichment opportunities outside of schools. And so it takes leaders that recognize that and recognize that's where you're going to spend a lot of your time. I'd also tell you that my perspective from where we are, K-12 is facing significant challenges, and some would say maybe existential challenges, right? So first, there are these structural issues. Just about every system I know is facing significant financial challenges. They're having cuts. So Columbus, they're trying to cut $50 million. Philadelphia's trying to cut almost $300 million. Chicago's over $600 million. This is just a start for this coming year. And it's going to get more challenging as they see declining enrollment. As a result, they're having to close a lot of facilities. They've got human capital issues, and they haven't even figured out how they're going to leverage AI yet. Then you have the outcomes piece, which is the NAEP results show us that only a little bit more than a third of our kids in the country are able to read and do math at a proficient level. Those are not really good statistics to sit on. So you've got to figure out how to move those numbers. And then there's a whole market and political piece of it in which states are passing bills that are basically shifting dollars through vouchers, ESA accounts to private schools, parochial schools, et cetera. So there's all these market pressures that these leaders are dealing with. The last thing I hear coming from them is, hey, we got to figure out how we do physics. Now, I mean civics, but same thing. But in some ways, it's a missed opportunity, right? Because I think one of the things that we've got to do, and I haven't heard much of it at this session, is that we've got to connect the outcomes and focusing on the data, how impactful civics education is in driving student outcomes, and not just the academic pieces of it, but things such as persistence, engagement, student behavior. Those are all big positive things that actually come out of that work because students begin to find purpose and meaning to things they're learning. And so I think that's something that we need to really push on in the K-12 sector, and through the work that many of you guys are doing, we'll be able to make the case for a stronger focus on civics. And I'll talk about it a little bit more. I'm a big believer in speech and debate, and I'll talk a little bit more about why I think that could be a real game-changing component for public education.
We will come back to that theme of debate for sure, because I think that's exactly right where some of those important skills are, and our pluralism is about debate, and we can connect those pieces. Selena, League of Women Voters has been educating citizens for more than 100 years. It had a huge job when it was founded. Women hadn't had the right to vote. Lots of folks said they shouldn't have the right to vote because they wouldn't be informed voters, and the League set out to prove everybody wrong. Yeah. So now you are expanding work in civic education again. What is the place of this concept of pluralism, the facts of our differences in both background and viewpoint, and how you are approaching your civic learning work?
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. So wonderful to see you all. I know it's the end of the day. So I sometimes worry that there's, that we think about pluralism as politeness. I think that in order to be pluralistic, you have to speak nice, everybody has to agree and all the things. And that's not how the League got started. And so we got started in 1920, 6 months before the 19th Amendment got ratified, during the women's suffrage moment in history. And they really tried to be polite at first. They were like, they even had this whole campaign, let mother vote, let's let our mothers vote. It didn't work. And so they had to do things that were outside of the norm. They protested, they marched, they had to push for that change publicly because debate wasn't enough. And so we just got back from, my colleague and I just got back from Selma and also South by Southwest, and the same thing is true of the civil rights movement. When you think about the civil rights movement and how there was an attempt to talk things out, to try to convince and persuade and all the things, and it did not work. And so they marched and protested. When we think about people walking over the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965, they were peaceful marchers, but the power structure did not perceive them that way. You know, they were beaten, people were killed, and you know, there were some ramifications for doing that peaceful protest. And so when I think about how things have come to be in this country, I think American progress has always happened through, you start with debate, and then you push when it gets to the point, when it goes to the wall of inequality. And so I think that when we're talking about pluralism, we have to be very careful to make sure that it doesn't mean neutrality, especially in the face of justice. And that things like protests, boycotts, public agreement, and all of these are democratic tools that we use in order to move this country forward. And if we think about the law, some of the things that the constitutional professor Akil said, you know, had we not had this document to guide where we were headed, the conflicts wouldn't have come, but they also wouldn't have moved this country forward. So I try to clarify that pluralism, even though it means, you know, multiple people, viewpoints, religions being able to exist in a single society, it is not absent of friction or protest or adversity.
Terrific, thank you so much. And Victoria, you are one of the leaders for America 250 and also have powerful memories of the bicentennial. Can you draw on those two things to help set the stage?
Absolutely. Thank you, Danielle. And thank you to iCivics and the Democratic Knowledge Project. These 2 days have been fabulous. I have learned so much and enjoyed meeting so many great people. I'm speaking to you as a retired educator who began teaching American history to 7th graders in suburban Cincinnati in 1974, just as the country was ramping up for the bicentennial. And for those of you that weren't around then or can't possibly remember what it was like, the country was very divided and in a very unhappy place. We were still struggling to accept the horrible assassinations in 1968, Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy. We had the ugly ending of the Vietnam War. We had great disappointment over the slow results to the civil rights movement. We had Watergate, we had Nixon's assassination, fight over the Equal Rights Amendment, and in addition to high unemployment and high inflation. Not a happy time for America. But what happened? As we were ramping up for the big bicentennial, we began to see on television, network television, if you would, every night at 8 o'clock, the bicentennial minute, when there was a story about our American history leading up to the Declaration of Independence. There was a freedom train that was touring all 50 states with artifacts telling the story of our founding. These contributed, I believe, to helping to remind us what we have in common, what is good about America, and perhaps laid the foundation for a more optimistic and positive mood, moving from the malaise of the 70s to mourning in America in the 80s. It contributed, I believe that. And I also believe that these big anniversaries offer a great opportunity for civic educators. However, my great disappointment is that in 1976, when the fireworks were over, there were few large-scale, sustained education programs to follow up on those lessons of the bicentennial. So 10 years later, we civic educators scrambled to get ready to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the Constitution. And then a few years after that, the 200th anniversary of the Bill of Rights in 1991. Now, my experience tells me that today, the semi-quincentennial could play a similar role in bringing us together, in uniting us, our country. But we should not make the same mistake as we did with our bicentennial. We should use this 250th anniversary of the Declaration, the 250th anniversary of the Constitution coming up in 2037, and the 250th anniversary of the Bill of Rights in 2041 to build education programs that last, that address the needs of our students, to create a generation that will have the knowledge, the skills, and the disposition to carry forth our American experiment.
Thank you so much for that call to action for all of us. And thank you for your remarks. There's a paradox in what you've all said. There, in various ways, Professor Amar, you talked about the shared American story. President Daniels, you talked about the way in which universities can draw on the incredible variety of the country and then help people form bridges in that context. And at the same time, Selena, you put the word friction on the table. So pluralism is always about both friction and the potential for coming together. This is a psychologically, I think, difficult position for us all to be in, to live with both of those things. So how should we think about that when we talk about educating young people, knowledge, skills, and dispositions and virtues? What about that last bucket? How do we actually live with this combination of friction and the aspiration to coming together? So let me go ahead, maybe go back to you first, Selena, and then.
Yeah, so I think we have to normalize it. You know, for some reason, you know, I've encountered more and more people who are like anti-conflict, and I come from a family where there's 6 kids and 2 parents, and so nothing is ever easy. And so when you're negotiating with that many people, 3 boys, 3 girls, like shit gets hard. But when I think about how important it is to just have the debate itself, and make it okay that we may not disagree, but the most important thing is that we can listen to each other, understand each other's viewpoints, and understand that the world is not going to end because we disagree. And I think that, you know, in 2016, we really saw this play out because, you know, regardless of the election and who you voted for, who you wanted to win, it separated families. There were people who were talking about on social media like, I'm not going to talk to this person over Thanksgiving. I'm like, holy, that's wild. That something so like something that happens all the time. Every 4 years of this country could divide families, could divide friendships. There were people, not following people on social media. And I think that undermines the whole purpose of us having discourse. When you have discourse, you have to understand that everyone is not going to agree. And so when I think about how the League got started in 1920, we were started to enfranchise and educate 10 million women, which represented half the American population at that time. But it was not popular. People did not want women to vote. They just said, let your husbands vote for you. And it's like, well, actually, my husband doesn't represent my values or an adequate representation of what I want to experience in society. And so I think that we have to be able to lean into the tough conversations, understanding that we're not always going to agree all the time, and making it okay for that disposition and discourse and disagreement to happen.
So, Bob, let's come back to debate on that subject and the place of debate in education. I was really struck in Professor Lepore's keynote when she told the story about how Columbia University used to have, what was it called again now? America's Town Hall, was that what it was called? 1,000 people gathering at Columbia University, then broadcast over the radio, and then local schools would convene their own communities to also have a debate connected to that one at a university campus. There in that story, we were hearing about a universal civic learning strategy at work. Debate has fallen away. I know it's something you think about, so Bob, come back to you, and then I'll come back to our university colleagues to hear about debate on campus.
Yeah, so debate became a really strong focus for me quite a few years ago, and it started when I was in Broward County as a superintendent. I think it was my second year there. I was on a flight coming back from Chicago that weekend, and I happened to be on the same plane with a bunch of students from one of our high school who had just participated in the National Forensic League in one of the suburbs outside of Chicago. So I sat next to this student. He was telling me about his experience when he first got to high school. He wasn't engaged. He just didn't like it. He really felt like dropping out. His grades weren't well. And so he told me how someone suggested that he get engaged with speech and debate. So he went, and one thing led to the other, and he got hooked on it and became really good at it. And he talked about how the skills that he actually learned in speech and debate, he applied to all these other subjects. So, fast forward a few months later, I attend graduation for that high school, and he's sitting up on the stage. He's the valedictorian of the class, and he's got a full scholarship to the University of Chicago. And, I've heard so many stories like that from students and parents about how debate changed and transformed their lives. So one of the things that we did, we pushed speech and debate to almost every single school in the system, not just the high schools, but the elementary schools, over 150 schools at the time when I left, and it became the largest speech and debate program in the nation. And what I've seen from that is how it just impacts students overall, not just their achievement, but in other aspects of their lives. And those skills are skills, I think, that are pretty critical when we talk about civics education. So we've then figured out a way to make sure that speech and debate is not some standalone club or activity you're in. It's actually integrated into core subject areas. And so teachers began to apply these kind of strategies as ways to engage kids. And I think today, especially in the age of AI, if you really want to test what kids know, you put them up in front of a class and have them debate on topic, you will really see it at the time. So I think one of the things that we should think about as we think about civics, I think is a similar strategy. How do we infuse it into core subject areas so it's just part of the culture of how we function, and we have kids learn how to debate ideas, how to have good friction, but do it with respect and dispositions that are values that we want to see. But I think that is something that we really need to think about leaning into as we talk about civics.
Victoria, do you want to jump in for a sec?
Yeah, I agree. I think that what we need to do is to make sure that our we are taking, I think, advantage of the moment we're in right now. And we know that we have people who understand we need to do something better with civic education. We have the big anniversaries to give what I think a grassroots support, and to take that to our policymakers and say, we must do better. I mean, our test scores, we heard earlier in the program that we're going to revise NAEP civics test. We're going to put it out there. We're going to have real data that shows where are we. And where are we is unacceptable. It's unacceptable to the American people. If we can show those test scores by grade, by state, I think it will be unacceptable to our state leaders. And so I think we want to make a strong case for civic education, not be defeated, not say, oh, there's STEM, or oh, there's literacy, we can't compete, or we somehow need to blend this or dilute it, or spread it out. I think not. I think this is a moment when we can carry that forward. I wanted to go back to something Professor Gilmore said about we must teach the truth and we must be inclusive. I would like to add we must also be accessible. And one of the problems, I think, and it's certainly true here with this panel and in this room, that I think we have in common an adult bias. You know, we think like adults. We have higher education, we have experience, we're deeply knowledgeable about our subject area, but do we really understand how a young learner thinks? What they understand, what matters to them, why they should care. And I think that we need to turn this telescope around here, not so much on the content, but on that young learner. They're the ones we need to reach. And these wonderful students that you had on the stage earlier, so exciting, but we all know they are the exception. There are many, many students who have nothing in common with them, and we must reach them too. So accessible. What can we do?
Absolutely. Say back to that kindergartner who's getting the instruction from the sixth grader about the importance of their right to vote. President Daniels, let me come to you. Can you imagine a world where Johns Hopkins is staging formal debates, propositions, there's a pro and a con side, and these are being live streamed to every league chapter in America simultaneously, red states and blue, to PTA meetings at the same time in the evening using empty after-school buildings. Imagine that. Could that happen at a place like Hopkins?
We'd love to see that happen. And, and the truth is, and I'm just building on what my co-panelists have talked about in the context of K-12 education, I think there are profound lessons and implications for what happens in university, particularly undergraduate education. So the idea that I loved of how we normalize disagreement, conflict, that we don't treat this as pathological, that we only engage with those with whom we share the same values and worldview, where we can be really sedulous in avoiding the prospect of conflict, but rather how do we kind of normalize the reality that we are in a highly pluralistic, heterogeneous society. We're going to agree on some things, we're going to disagree on other things, and we can have that engagement. As it turns out, at the end of those interactions, we actually leave as fellow citizens, that we can still retain the bonds of comity and the sense of being part of a broader enterprise. So in that context of normalizing, I think the power of debate is really, really essential for how we move this enterprise along. So, when we looked at the literature in writing about the role of the university in democracy, it was really striking that if you looked at some of the empirical work that showed, this is now in the years 2016, 2017, there was almost no debate across campuses when speakers were being invited to universities. Typically, these are sole speaker events when speakers come on campus, and then of course we know in some cases you have the celebrated or notorious deplatformings and so forth, which reinforces this sense that we're remarkably intolerant of one another. And we sort of, in that context where it's also speaker events, we're not actually teaching our students that actually you can have difficult conversations, debates, interactions across a range of different views that just give them sort of tools and precedents for how they can interact with one another. And it also is important in creating this sense that in the context of debate, particularly where you're trying to illuminate differences between progressive and conservative positions, that these are arguments that can be put forward and engaged, critiqued, but ultimately with the view to seeing where are we divided by fundamental differences in values, and where are we divided by, well, it turns out we have shared values. We just have different views on the empirical state of the world. These are things that we can do. And so I think that at Hopkins, indeed, I think across most universities today, there's a real recognition that this is a powerful vehicle for instantiating the prospects of pluralism.
That's great. Yep. Bob, you want to jump in? And then
Thinking about the fact that, you have to, I think as leaders, have to have tangible examples that people can see that show these things that we talk about so they're not just empty words. And I think about a situation I had many years ago when I first got into K-12. I started working in technology, and I changed some policies where I changed how the funding was allocated to schools for technology that they purchased because we wanted to centralize it and manage it better. And there was a principal who was a key member of the Principals Association. I mean, he just went off, and he just, he and I were just going at it. And then I went to a retreat sometime after that and we had a guest speaker. Her name was Jeannie Duck. She's a director at the Boston Consulting Group, and she writes a lot about change. And she said one thing that always stuck with me. She goes, to get someone to understand your perspective or you to understand theirs, it takes somewhere around 8 or 9 conversations. And you should really spend that kind of time with folks and just don't brush them off based on those initial interactions. So what I did, I reached back out to this principal. I said, hey, look, I want to create an advisory group of principals to inform my decisions so I can make better decisions, and I'd like you to chair it. And he's like, me? Are you kidding? And so he agreed to do that. Over the course of several months, I was sitting in a meeting, and he's there like defending our decisions and things that we're doing. It was a remarkable change of events, but it would have never got there if I didn't change my perspective and recognize that, hey, you may be at odds with someone, but you just need to continue to have those conversations so you get to a part where you can have mutual respect and understanding for each other. So I just point that out as an example because a lot of people noticed that example, and it changed the way many of my managers and staff thought about how they interacted with others.
thank you. That is a great example. I'm afraid I've done a terrible job of taking questions from the Slido. You'll have to forgive me. We have just such an incredibly rich panel up here, and I was jealously grabbing them for conversation. I'm going to give the last question to Professor Amar. So we have taken this concept of pluralism. We've acknowledged that democracy is about friction and unity simultaneously, and the constant tension between those two things. So you told us, Akhil, that we needed to understand the story. What can we learn from the American story that can help us hold that tension between the friction and the unity and stay with it?
So if I'm teaching in high school or junior high, and I hear you, Victoria, we got to put ourselves in the kids' shoes. Way back when, I loved role plays. I loved mock experiences. Okay, we're going to have a trial. You're the defense counsel, you're the prosecutor, you 12 are the jurors. Okay, and now you're actually doing democracy, and that's kind of fun. Okay, we're going to reenact the 1850s. You're Lincoln-Douglas debates. You're Abe Lincoln, you're Stephen Douglas, you're Frederick Douglass, you're Elizabeth Cady Stanton, you're Harriet Beecher Stowe. Now you go at it. Okay, and that's fun for them. And it takes a little bit of the pressure off because they don't have to put themselves quite on the line. They're playing a role, but they're learning how to articulate. If I'm in college, if I'm at Yale College, my college, I'm going to actually try to give scholarships to half of the admitted students, which we didn't used to do, and we're giving international scholarships and not just domestic scholarships. If I'm in the law school, I get rid of legacy preferences, which we did. But that's only half the equation, bringing more people in. Now we have to model discourse. So I always co-teach for the last 15 years. I'm a moderate Democrat. I co-teach every year with the founder and national co-chair of the Federalist Society. And we weren't friends initially in Yale College. We ran against each other. He beat the hell out of me, you know? And then I realized that guy's good. I can learn from that guy. I want that guy to be my friend because he can teach me his tricks. And now Steve Calabrese and I co-teach constitutional law every year together, and we sometimes agree, sometimes disagree. When I teach to the undergraduates, I make sure that I have a whole array of TAs, and my TAs have actually clerked for justices across the spectrum. So we can model this, but it's going to be different at different levels.
That's wonderful. That's a great note to end on. Thank you for the concrete examples that you both gave from your experience, and thank you all for sharing your depth of perspective and wisdom. Let's give our panel a round of applause. Yeah.